Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. We are just about to get started. Just as a reminder, please keep your microphones muted and your cameras off. That just helps us with bandwidth. And please do bear with us if we have any technical issues. So our speaker today is Andrew Skinner. Many of you from WITS will know him. He was here for his undergrad and master's and PhD, and then did spend some time at UNISA as a postdoc and is now back at RARI as a postdoc. So we're running a little bit late, so without wasting any more time, Andrew, thank you very much for being with us today, and over to you.
All right. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My talk today is entitled The Other Neuropsychological Model, Brain Lateralisation and Neuromaterialism on Animated Landscapes. Hopefully everyone online is getting this and is seeing me. Yeah, so before I get started, I'd just like to give some context about what I'm going to be talking about, because it fits into sort of a broader project that I've been working on, and that is I'm interested in emic materialism, or at least an emic materialism, an insider's account of material properties of objects, rock art, places, the things that are our disciplinary interest. My focus area is clown ethnography, so I'm trying to sort of get at certain elements of clown material theory. And one reason for this is when we're engaging in informed interpretation, it can sometimes be difficult to keep everything in mind at once. So I think we sometimes slip into stochastic exegesis. What I mean by that is we'll be working on ostriches, and we'll look up ostriches in the ethnography. We'll perhaps find some other folks working on a related subject. We'll look into what they're covering. We'll see that ostriches tend to overlap, have some associations with territoriality, certainly in a clown archive. So, we'll look up territorialized resources in the ethnographic material. That use is socially regulated. We'll look up place, ownership, social regulation, but that doesn't necessarily exhaust all of the relevant dimensions to what we're thinking about. There could be mysterious gaps, things that are not quite what we're getting to, but we're also sort of not aware that we're not getting to. So there's nothing really wrong with this approach. I think it's just interesting that we can end up working on these incidentally siloed subjects. Some things become clear to us because they are, for the moment, what we're interested in. But there are things that remain mysterious, out of focus in the background. So yeah, I'm sort of interested in this sort of connective tissue between subjects. Yeah. It's a bit tricky because it turns out that how do you go about this at all? How do you explore frameworks that typically remain implicit either in our own work or in the ethnography? I'm interested in stuff, things, objects, material. You start off and you realize that there are some other dependencies. There's a whole bunch of other things that certainly I would probably take for granted without realizing it. So yeah, my sort of approach so far has been to break this down into its constituent parts and drill down into specific ideas one at a time. And yeah, so that's what myself and some of my colleagues have been doing. You take a line on something, you give that a really deep ethnographic treatment. Because we don't necessarily attach it to an interpretive subject, we can start to break down the problem of the world writ large into its constituents, and then yeah, hopefully you'll come around eventually to having, once you've got all of these individual components, to having quite a complete picture of the stuff that makes the world work. So far my project has sort of been to do sort of place and space, and then consciousness. So giving each of these a thorough ethnographic examination. I'll hopefully have something coming soon about humanity, the idea of humanity, time, causality, the things that we might not otherwise account for in analysis. But there is sort of one more challenge. How do you begin to extrapolate organizing principles from a source that doesn't present itself as a theoretical text? Like the Blake Lloyd Archive is not a textbook about all of the relevant metaphysics. It doesn't account for, it doesn't have a straightforward explanation. This is the theory of X, Y, Z. And so how do you get to that? So for place and space, I looked at navigation. I want to know, I want to describe to someone else, how do you get from A to B? Well, what I probably do in the process is I might articulate some account of value in the landscape. Like, what do I care about? What do I think you ought to care about? For notions of consciousness, I looked at neuroanatomical theory. It turns out there is actually a fairly sort of rich vein of how does the brain work, or how does the mind work specifically in the archive. It's often implicit, but it's kind of still there. And then they have discussions about where are minds? How do you identify things that have consciousness relative to yourself? So people, the voices represented in the ethnography, they have opinions about these things. Maybe not overtly, but they're sort of in there. There are commentaries, implicit commentaries, quite often. So there's more coming on this, but you get the drift. So this is not really special. I'm not really the first person to do this. I'm certainly not the only person doing it currently. But that's just by way of giving a sense of where this talk is coming from. Because when I was looking at mind and consciousness in particular recently, and doing some comparative ethnography, looking at other world regions, you start to notice that there are these fairly consistent threads between certain largely hunter-gatherer, but some other communities as well. There's some interesting structural similarities between these various populations, and this does overlap some sound sources as well. So like there's different cultural elaborations as you would expect, but there are these underlying patterns as well. So amongst those patterns might be that being a person is not a property exclusive to human beings. There are things that are not humans but are persons. There's the idea that like the social world is not a thing that only happens between humans. The social world is something that branches out into the environment. Culture is something that happens in the environment and in between humans. That there is property transfer, like my individual personal characteristics can sort of leach over into those of others that I have close associations with. Who becomes you is sort of my little sort of easy, more slightly simpler phrasing for it. Objects don't stop being what they were to begin with. So you make something out of an animal, that artifact retains some of the social relations that humans had with that animal. So there are others as well, but there's this reasonably consistent assumption across a variety of different world regions that point to the sense that the considerations of the world, the relevant things to a human population in the world, are not only practical, they are social. So you give a thought to why. Why might this be? Why might it be so consistent? So all of this brings me somewhat circuitously around to today's focus. But I want to start with a little thought experiment. I want to start by asking, where are you? Okay, and I want you to consider this question phenomenologically, like, where are you in your body? Okay, so for me personally, I would say, well, I'm in my body, but I'm kind of more in my upper body than in my lower body. Like I look down on my toes, and there's kind of a gradient there. Like if I stub my toe, it's happening down there relative to where I am. But if I have a headache, like a really bad headache, it kind of shakes the whole world. Like so I'd say like, okay, well, I'm kind of more up here than I am down there. And if I were to be like really precise and kind of think about it quite hard, I'd say, well, I'm sort of somewhere behind my eyes a little bit, like a little bit below, and sort of, so if I were to do an XYZ, it's kind of, I'm in here somewhere. And my world extends outwards from that. So, my sight ranges to the boundaries of this room. My hearing sometimes, so if the windows weren't shut, my hearing would imply that there's more world beyond there, some fuzzy boundaries. But before we've gotten to my cultural sensibilities about the shape of the universe, my sort of encultured understanding of like solar system, galaxies, these like expanding spheres of things. Before we get to that point, the shape of my universe is this kind of boxy, well, it's this node, then a boxy thing, and then like a fuzzy boundary beyond, right? And when I'm up in the berg, the boundaries are like way further away. So my senses are giving me a different shape to everything. The sky can feel huge. Almost like it has this gravitational pull a little bit. Personally, the sky sometimes seems closer during the day than by night. At night, it can seem like it's very distant. This is all subjective. You will all have a subjective account. But I could probably start to sketch a diagram based on my senses about what the shape of my cosmos is. Maybe I'll be really detailed. Maybe I'll have like all of my internal processes. That'll be like around that node in the middle. And then there'll be this declining gradient of certainty. There'll be the things that I know really well, and then this like ragged edge where my senses reach further than my ability to know what's there. So I could probably sketch this out. Like I could probably make a diagram to show you something of how all this fits together. Now, that's my cosmic imagination at a very naive level. Before we've added in culture, my diagram with that in that exercise would be pretty simple. We obviously have more than just our senses. We do have culture. That you'll be aware the shamanistic cosmology kind of does a similar thing. It generates this kind of cosmic axis. But kind of what's interesting about both these cases is that what you feel becomes the metaphor for the underlying metaphysics. Like how things work is based kind of on how you're intuiting the world through your senses. So in altered states of consciousness, you get the sense of flying out the top of your head, weightless into the sky, the feeling of the world closing in, getting dark around your ears and your head, and like this crushing sensation. So the sense that it goes down as well. So this example will hopefully be familiar to most folks, but there's a sense that, from this, culture then takes these experiential qualities and elaborates them into this idea of a tiered cosmos, this vertically tiered sort of diagram of how things fit together. But yeah, it's that idea that your experience is a sort of notionally empirical account of how the world is. Okay, we are likely to believe that our senses are a fair representation of the world. That's how we make sense of things. So we're going to interpret what comes in and use those to kind of draw a map of how the world is shaped and how it broadly works. So thinking about those animist intuitions from before, those ideas of like the world being full of persons, like, is there some reason why that feels a certain way? Okay, like, there seems to be this idea that there's a sense of other persons out in the world. So there's a question here, like, is there something about the brain that gives the world this texture? So in the Kham ethnography, the informants talk about the feeling of being observed from far away, of being subject to the whims of others who are imposing social conditions on you, obligations. They've got these like intuitions, these like shivers. You get like a sense that something's onto you. And I'll be out in the middle of nowhere and be like, yeah, I get it. I know that feeling. So, looking into potential mechanisms, there's this thing that stood out, which is brain function lateralization, which is what I'm going to get into today. So what I mean by this, so brain function lateralization is, in a technical description, the specialization and uneven distribution of cognitive processes on the left-right axis of the brain. Okay, so to give a sense of that is a specialization. That is, the bits of your brain don't all do the same thing. There are different places in the brain, and those things are good at different processes. And then these networks don't cover the whole brain symmetrically. They are isolated to different spaces, and those typically fall onto this left-right continuum. So one thing is kind of interesting, like it's kind of weird to think about why this would be at all. Like why is it that this primary organ that is most of us isn't the same on the left-right? Like that's an interesting issue. So there does seem to be some evolutionary advantage to this. If you've got a whole bunch of competing processes evenly distributed, the way you'd allocate resources to that is you'd have to then spread it across all of the tissue. So this way you can kind of have like a node that does a whole lot of one kind of work, and all the resources needed for that one kind of work can get routed efficiently. The other thing is you also kind of don't want the outputs interfering with each other. You don't want it all sort of bottlenecking. Like the whole brain now feeds back to your executive center, your sense of self. You're now going to get like all of these processes simultaneously. It's useful to be able to say like, we want some of this right now, and we're going to pump the brakes on this other thing. So Ian McGilchrist's Master and His Emissary is kind of cool, like fairly accessible take on this idea if you want something to read. It's kind of a neat book. But as a quick aside, this is probably something that you've seen a million times in a bunch of annoying, probably ads down the side of your page. What kind of brain type are you? It may shock some of you to hear that this is not medical consensus. We'll get into the specifics shortly, but this is not it. This sort of left, this is your logical side, this is your creative side. It's not entirely how it goes. So yeah, a quick line on how this works in a more sort of mechanical sense. So sensory signals arrive at the senses. So we're going to do vision right now. Vision is just the easiest to show you, like we're going to get into some diagrams shortly. But there are parallels in your other senses. Okay, so signals arrive through your senses. So visual stimuli hit your eyes. That signal gets filtered and then routed to different hemispheres. So this is an illustration of the process of frequency selection. So I'm using some figures from Flavaris and Robertson 2016. They've got like a fairly detailed account of this. But so the visual signal, so if you look at the bottom row there, there's a flower. And that's kind of an approximation of most of the signaling coming in through your senses. And then in that bottom row, we've divided that input into its different frequency levels. So I'm talking about frequency here. Like imagine you made this picture 3D and you drag a needle across the top of it. Where do you expect it to skip, right? So, the high frequency elements are the quick skips, the da-da-da-da-da-da. So it's all of the like high contrast things, it's the spiky bits, it's it's the things that come across in the visual signal as having a lot of fine details. The low frequency would be the slow, like the broad strokes, the slow, literally the lower frequency, the slow rise and fall. And then on that top row, you can see a kind of like plot of the frequency variances. So the low frequency on one side, we've got these big gestural things, basically two sort of waves there, and on the right-hand side, all of the little details. Okay, so your senses take in a signal, all of the fine stuff goes one way, all of the broad stuff goes another way. So what happens is that these typically correspond to what we'll call local and global elements. So the local, the high frequency, the details, and the global is this like the big thing. So as a very straightforward example on the left there, that the global is the A, but the local details are the E's. Okay, and yeah, when we plot these out, so on the right-hand side there, that second figure, we'll see how on the frequency of the signal, the high frequency stuff is getting routed to the left hemisphere, and the low frequency stuff right hemisphere. Now your brain gets all of the signal, but one hemisphere is a high pass filter. The right hemisphere is a low pass filter. Your world is not going to be only forest. It's not going to be only trees. You're going to selectively get more trees or more forest in a kind of integrated way. But you'll be optimizing for some of those details. So at any given moment, more processing resources are given to local or global information in the visual display. And then, you have this like focus shift effect. You're viewing forest, then a tree in the forest. So the tree in the forest is the local element in a global scene. You look at the tree becomes the global, and the leaves and all of that become the local elements. Okay, now we've routed these elements. They've gone into the brain. They're now being picked up and differentially processed on both sides. And there's a reason this bifurcation is happening at all, and that's the corpus callosum. That's that structure in the middle there. And it's the interface between these two hemispheres. It connects not only the hemispheres themselves, but regions with similar functions. So like it actually projects a little bit. Like this diagram is to sort of show where the majority of it is, but colossal fibers sort of spread outwards, and it's almost like a map of how functions in your brain. Like the thing itself physically is almost like an artifact. It's almost like a map of how these things all fit together. And yeah, so when you need to have your visual areas and your motor areas, so you're doing a thing and you're moving towards an object you can see, you'll obviously want those things interfacing well. So the corpus callosum facilitates these kinds of connections. So yeah, you kind of want you want like processes to be able to work well together, but you also kind of don't want everything at once. You don't want all of the leaves, all of the trees, all of the forest all at once. Life's going to get hard to navigate. So another thing that the corpus callosum does is that it inhibits activity. It pumps the brakes on one side and lets the other side have more screen time. Okay. And yeah, so it's in a more technical sense, it sends excitatory signals to one side and inhibitory signals to the other. Some things are in focus, some things come in, other things go. Okay. So functions in the brain are rooted to things that are compartmentalized. Okay, so we've got this frequency selective routing going on. We can kind of make some guesses about what these signals, what these signals imply about the places they're going. So the left hemisphere with its high frequency bias shows a preference for these like local details, categorical, so like breaking the world up into discrete objects, and self-referential, so things like what's related to me, like what am I doing? And so yeah, left hemisphere structures contribute significantly to your sense of self. And planning like the steps between yourself and something you want to do. The right hemisphere networks are more active during this like diffuse, holistic awareness, your sense of the whole world around you. It's also good at multisensory integration, so taking a bunch of different inputs and sticking them together. And incidentally, it's also very good at your sort of social processing. When you need to take in another person that you're communicating with, you've got to have their voice, the tone, body language, context, all that stuff. You'll typically be using the sort of multi-sensory integration, multi-source, multimodal. You're bringing a whole bunch of stuff together and you're making it a complete picture. You'll be using more right-biased processing. So there's some spillover in how these things play out. So like the regions that are in one area tend to influence the behavior of nearby ones. Like right side networks tend to do both social processing and multisensory processing. Some of the structures responsible for this are literally their neighbors, and they're sort of interlinked a little bit. And so when you are getting a holistic picture, you're using the same networks that you use for social processing. So sometimes you end up with like a social vibe coming through when you're feeling the world writ large. Okay. So yeah, these specializations are kind of relative rather than absolute. Which bits of the brain do what won't always be clear. But it's interesting because we have in neuropsychology, at least, there are these natural experiments in neuropathology and developmental difference. So cases where people have, for whatever reason, kind of developmental disconnection or underconnectivity between hemispheres. So there's a condition called agenesis of the corpus callosum, people being born with either very little or almost none of it. And they show a capacity for really focused activity of one hemisphere at a time. But it's really hard to then switch over to processes that are biased to the other side. That you can almost get stuck a little bit in one or the other. Conditions affecting sort of social processing are affected sometimes in autism spectrum conditions. We sort of see a sense of the environment being less social. The world seems less populated by potential agents and more dominated by discrete, largely non-social objects. So these conditions are diverse. They come in all different shapes and sizes. This doesn't sort of encompass everything, but some degree of developmental disconnection or underconnectivity is quite common in these. Yeah, so when you add in this frequency selective routing and the corpus callosum is sort of like maintaining more kind of left biased, more kind of right biased, you end up with a world that has kind of two textures at a given moment. Okay, you have a world full of details, full of objects that are sort of broken up and apart from each other, and that you kind of target for what you're doing, the subjects of your plans. And you have a world on the other side, which is this like broad strokes. It's like it's the big picture. It's like potential, movement, tendency, social context, things coming and going. And yeah, like you're not. This is not a light. There's not a light switch. You don't have like a really hard one kind of processing bias then another. Your consciousness is a through line through the middle, and you're sort of like you're edging more into one than another. This is kind of evolutionarily adaptive. You want to be able to plan your approach to a fruit on a branch before alternating to the broad sense of whether or not there might be a tiger plotting its route to you. But yeah, we have this kind of coloring effect of different brain regions working together to give your different sensations of the world these other characteristics. So like when the world is all broken up, it's full of possibilities of like the context of your actions, your plans, and the right side, the world will be full of sort of social implications. So yeah, we have this kind of rhythm. You're a subjective agent in a world full of the subjects of your attention, and then you are a subject yourself in a world full of potential others. And it's precisely because of this carryover, this through line through the middle. You're going around doing things on purpose, and then your attention switches. You switch to the potential that others might be doing the same, because that sense of agency and purpose and planning, it doesn't leave you. And this is kind of an important point. The transition has a feeling. You're focused on something that fits into your plans about the world. Your attention shifts to the broader landscape, and now you're considering your position in the context of this. Some of that agentful quality carries over. Your environmental awareness is sort of colored by the social assessment. So the landscape doesn't feel so empty. Maybe it's examining you back. Maybe you're the subject of a plan. Now, this is neural architecture. This shift between local and global processing has certain qualities that are sort of enhanced. Some things are more obvious to you. And yeah, to go back to that thought experiment from others from earlier, this makes the world feel a certain way. Like you aren't the only thing going around with intention. You are not the only agent in the world. Your sense of the world is colored a little bit by this sensory quality. It is something that's happening because of how you process sensory information. It's not necessarily a cultural elaboration. Okay, so just a little bit, like shamanism, we have this sensory and neural substrate that culture then takes and works with. We're not saying, I don't think anyone would say, the shape of the brain leads to certain cultural expressions necessarily, just that you've got this baseline from which culture sort of runs with. Yeah, and so this is a step, I think, in why people tend to treat material in the world a certain way, certainly in some of these contexts where they're part of quite long-term environmental relationships. Like humans in hunter-gatherer contexts are kind of making these quite interesting social relations as practical ones. And yeah, like there is in this a sense of other subjectivities, of other things that are like you. The world feels like it's alive, like it's aware, and that it is significantly socialized. And the implications for what you're drawing from the world, the materials that you're engaging in the world, is that they have, amongst others, social properties. Like there are social dimensions that inflect what you are going to do in the world, how you're going to approach things. When we think about over the span of time, as societies develop these quite specialized relationships with their landscapes, other inhabitants, culture creates frameworks that draw from this. And you'll validate it. You'll interact with others in your context, and you'll say, you'll have this process of feedback. Someone describes their sensations, their intuitions about the world, and the others around them will come back with their versions. But because of the consistency, the neurological underlying neurological architecture, the likelihood that these will be consistent or have a certain flavor to them is higher. And then this feeds into the processes of accumulating environmental knowledge, technical skill. This is, to a degree, at least, explaining why certain kinds of habit and intuitions tend to be so widespread. So it suggests something kind of something interesting, perhaps reasonably fundamental about human cognition. That there's an aspect of this that consistently contributes to experiences of subjective others in the landscape. Okay, so as before, it doesn't mean that these are universal. Culture will decide on what it takes in, what it rejects, what it emphasizes, plays up, plays down. But yeah, it suggests that there's a tendency to experience the environment as populated by other conscious subjects, and that this is something to keep in mind when we're thinking about the nature of places and things. Like, why are people using certain places? Why are they using certain materials? When they're making choices about what to engage, what to represent, maybe in artistic expressions, what they're accounting for. They're not making purely practical calculations. I mean, this is not news in itself. But we're responding both to cultural background, but also these kind of perceptual possibilities, these cognitive structures. So yeah, we look at the ethnography and we see references to places having personhood, to references to non-humans, gods, spirits, ancestors, animals, other sort of other categories of being. And in some cases, in some ways, it's not like a metaphor. This is kind of reality in some meaningful sense, that there's some dimension of human cognition that is adding this layer, the social layer on top. And so, yeah, when we look at the archaeological record then, and we see evidence of how societies are developing material, technology, cultural expression to amplify, explore, sometimes validate or sort of recursively deal with. When we're interpreting these materials, we kind of ask, what kind of cosmic, what kind of universe is being represented here? What are these folks reflecting about consciousness, being in the world, environmental relationships? And this can be a kind of a different question sometimes from what it is that they're trying to represent. Like if we think about rock art and potential, it's kind of asking what kind of universe is being inhabited here. So that's more or less the sort of run of it. You can find the full paper that this talk is based on my ResearchGate, along with several others. Any questions?
Thanks very much, Andrew. That was great. Any questions in the room? If you've got a question, perhaps you could just come and stand here and then you'll be closer to the microphone. Do we have any questions online? None as yet. I think everybody is stunned by the breadth of your talk. Andrew, if I could ask you, do you see ways in which this, at the risk of oversimplifying it, applies directly to some of the imagery that we have in the kind of fine line SAN corpus? Are there things that you think thinking in this way will maybe help us understand?
So I think in a large part, the interpretive applications are to advance a certain kind of socialized account, both of the formal qualities of the images themselves. So what is the potential social significance of images being represented a certain way if you're reading them as social agents? So if you look to the ethnography, then what are the implications of an animal socially? What are the social relations implied in engagement, use, the sort of like life cycle of both animal components and animals themselves. Potentially treating those as agencies, and then looking at this like the paint ingredients. Taking that principle that things don't stop being what they are. So like pigment components being made of animal, being made of places, being made of things that have social implications. Your analysis, even on a sort of like a chemical level, can come back to that idea of these things have social implications. And then for place, quite similarly. So you might insert it at different levels of your analysis and decide, okay, well, I'm doing a really like focused thing, so I want to deal with the implications of pigment composition. I'll maybe read up about social implications of an animal's components, or like a representation of an artifact. Sort of similarly, if that artifact is made out of XYZ social agent, can I read into that social relations of certain kinds?
Brilliant, thank you. Any questions in the room? Everyone's still stunned. Any questions online?
I saw something come up in the chat, but I don't know.
Let's have a look at the chat. Joe Richards says, please can you share the link for the complete paper? We can do that on my laptop. We'll do that. Thanks, Joel. Any raised hands? Sam.
Hi there. Yes, can you hear me?
Just a moment, Sam. Can everyone in the room hear that, or is it okay? Yeah, Sam, go for it.
Hi, I hope everyone can hear me. Yes, thank you, David, and thank you, Andrew, for your talk. I'm less stunned, but only because I knew what he was going to be talking about. Otherwise, I would also be stunned because I've been working with Andrew for the last decade, and this is sort of like in one way it's one branch, but it is in some ways also an accumulation of the direction which Andrew's been going. And of course, Andrew's masters was supervised by Mark McGranahan. So, those who've been reading the stuff that's been published along these lines will be also hopefully slightly less stunned by this. And if you haven't been reading it, you ought to be stunned, I think, because it's a complementary approach to what has become to be thought of as the dominant paradigm, depending on how you look at it, or just the Lewis Williamsian approach. And so this is not contra to the shamanistic hypothesis, not that David's ever called it that, and that is the really important point, I think. It's not set up in direct contrast to, but it is it's a much larger umbrella under which to look at things. And so that's why, David, I really liked your question. How does Andrew see ways in which this can be applied to rock art? And this is the universe in which the rock art is being created. And so I'm sort of the Skinner's bulldog in that sense, that when Andrew does things like this, and takes a deep dive down this avenue, that avenue, the next avenue, I almost see it as one of my jobs to understand where he's going with it and say, look, people, this is what's going on now. This is the universe in which our rock art's being created. It's nothing less than that. So can this be applied to the rock art? Well, no, it's sort of like the rock art needs to be applied to this. It's that big. It's that big. What is a hunter-gatherer thinking? They're moving through a landscape. They are negotiating with entities that are all around them all the time, or some are here and some are further away, and depending on where you are. And so, sorry, this is a very, very convoluted way of getting to my actual question, which would be to say to Andrew, would you, as an experiment, describe to us what would happen if, say, you walked into somewhere like Homopatsua, which article was a sort of looked like a smaller thing, what you would experience as a San person, potentially. This is, we can never really know, but taking all of these things into consideration, and you see a giant snake painted across the rock face. Can you explain it to us in those terms?
Well, I can take a swing. I wouldn't necessarily want to emphasize my perspective too heavily, but yeah. So just for some context, Homopatsua is a very large shelter in Highland Lesotho. There's a lot of really interesting interactions happening with the landscape. There's a sort of river just below it, and it's got this huge parabolic face where when you're standing underneath it, the river is sort of echoing back down on you. And sort of just directly below that face, there is a huge 4.5 meter snake painted. So with some background in ethnography, you would say like, well, snakes and rivers have close associations. Some of that's carried over into the contemporary period as well. But you might overlay your social considerations. You might say like, well, okay, this is a place that is defined at least significantly by its associations with river and then by extension with snake. And so when we are representing something, so, at least more speculatively, we're representing something that we are taking for another conscious agent. So that might be that the river is a conscious agent, the place, or the thing that we're representing. And that because that thing is at least part of what conditions the place, it gives the place its significance. We might say like, okay, well, I need to condition my behavior. So a lot of, if you look at Nana Say, there are kind of equivalents in the Kalahari, these systems for social interaction. You might apply the social expectations in that system to the place in a comparable way that you might apply it to, I have seen a physical snake somewhere. I'm sort of doing this multi-layered thing of having a conversation with the place, having a conversation with the images that are probably there before. They'll have social relations. They'll represent past populations whose signatures are still around, and then the physical properties of the space that I'm in, and that I would work from my social understanding of the implications of those things being present as part of my analysis.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Are there any other questions online?
There was also a hand.
Oh, we have a. Do you want to come up and use so that people online can hear you?
And then I think that's good.
And then okay, so you can just speak from there. Yeah?
So my question was actually quite close to what Sam asked. I was curious about your case study and like how would you apply, like what question would you ask facing a case study? Like, do you use this to interpret the images or to understand what happened socially when there was workout happening, being made? And like, did you have different case studies across Southern Africa? And yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so just on case studies, yeah. So at least some of this was like I was sort of saying initially, the intent was to try and do a really zoomed out, almost case agnostic study based on the things that are common between ethnographic source contexts, and then working back towards that, back from that towards case studies. So yeah, like the Homopatsua example is one, but effectively, you'll have your like constellation of things that were responsible for why a site looks the way that it does. And one, various sections of that will be practical realities. People are making choices that are very nuts and bolts, but amongst those things will be social ones. And thankfully the ethnography is full of social mores, like what's polite, what can be expected of another person, be they human or non-human, that you would almost place those at a level with the practical ones. And so like, okay, people are making material choices, they're making social choices, and that differentiating between those will be kind of hard because subjectively they're kind of the same. They're almost the same consideration, at least partly contributed to by this asymmetric cognition.
Thanks, Andrew. We need to give you a moment to breathe while the questions are on. Pippa Scottness, Pippa, over to you.
So, Andrew, the Blake and Lloyd archive gives rise to a lot of the questions that you're asking. The interactions with landscape, interactions with human people and other beings, the agency of objects, and the agency of the cosmology, and of things that have traditionally been understood as not conscious, and so on. And I think we all grapple with those when we try to understand stories and the ways in which that thinking contributes to an understanding of rock art. And then, given that the neuroscience stuff, which I have a passing interest in, so I speak from no great, no immersion, let's say, but given that the neuroscience stuff is so controversial, I mean, not necessarily the bilateral mechanisms of the brain and so on, but the extrapolations that are made from those. I mean, I know Gilchrist comes in for a lot of flack from his, as a psychiatrist making extrapolations from neurological stuff in the brain. So given all of that, it's not clear to me what you think the neuro stuff actually delivers.
So I think, like part of this project was this kind of multi-ethnographic project. So, I think that was part of why I tried to contextualize in the initial sections of the talk to say that this is a project that I am doing alongside work on the Blake Lloyd. So I do have my interest in the Blake Lloyd, but I also have interest in more than that, because I think the thing that people sometimes don't take into consideration sufficiently, and like I definitely appreciate the sort of criticisms that McGilchrist does come into, because I think he often overextends the things he ought to be saying. My reference to him there was primarily as a kind of, here is a treatment of it, particularly contrasting that sort of left brain, right brain, creative, logical thing. His explanation of the mechanisms is reasonably accurate. Whether or not we can take the implications is maybe something different, but you obviously will read things critically. But I think in terms of, I use the Blake Lloyd as context initially, but my project is materialism, this kind of agentic material or agentful materialism beyond the archive as well. Because the thing to bear in mind is that, say, San rock art in Southern Africa is thousands of years old. It's spread across thousands of kilometers. The Blake Lloyd is a colonial artifact representing testimonies of people at a particular moment. So I think it's quite interesting to say, like, okay, well, we've got folks in the 20th century or 20th century Kalahari, 19th century Orange River frontier and Cape. But we've got folks in the circumpolar north who are saying kind of interestingly comparable things. In Mesoamerica, there's these interesting through lines. And so at least some of this project was to say, like, okay, well, isn't it interesting that these intuitions are so widespread, that that there is something that humans seem to do really consistently, that they seem to take into consideration really consistently. So on one side, it's to say that there's almost like a very perhaps almost abstract project in, I'm interested in why these things are widespread. Why, like, is there a reason that they're so consistent? Can I look to other mechanisms, other interesting sort of underlying things that might, not determine necessarily, but like you pick up a tool that was made by a thing that wasn't human yet, and it sits in your monkey palm just right. And you're like, that's kind of miraculous. That's kind of really interesting. And so your biology is like a frame, and culture is elaborating that on that in diverse ways. It doesn't, the shape of your hand doesn't determine the geometry of the tool necessarily, but there's something kind of interesting there, that when you then take that a little bit further, you bring in culture for your context, you bring in your case study, you start to say like, okay, well, I wasn't really thinking about socializing this material before, you know, or I was thinking primarily of what's being represented is the social relation. But the material composition of pigment, for example, might not be something that I innately socialize. Or site selection, the use of, you know, like there's this consistent issue of you walk into a site and there's a lovely piece of sandstone right there and it's got nothing on it. And then like around the corner in this really odd little hook, there's a whole bunch of art there. Like this is potentially something where I would hope, given enough elaboration, that I'd be able to come back around with, okay, well, there are structural factors that contribute. There are structural factors that I can use to then cross-reference preferably several ethnographic source domains to give me a better chance of landing at something that I feel is a good representation of the scope of different reasons people might do things. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thanks, Andrew. Any other questions in the room? Can't see from the thing up. Any other questions online? Any other raised hands? All right, then one from me. Andrew, given the sort of conventional or inherited or long-lived tradition of looking at rock art in shamanistic terms, and now the change with new animisms and the attention to that, what, in your view, is the relationship between shamanism and animism, either cognitively or culturally, or as it applies to rock art? You might talk around that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. Yeah. So I see them as largely co-occurring. So I think if you just to look out at the world, like in an empirical sense, like if you survey ethnographies, you know, like it's almost incidental that we call these things different things. You know, like there's a little bit of a need to do so literally just so that we know what we're talking about at a given moment. But I consider, you know, especially you look at the source domains, I would say that, you know, I'm reasonably confident in there being shamanistic elements. I mean, you've walked into any number of shelters in the Drakensberg, there are a bunch of people in a circle and a bunch of them are bending over, or they're doing, you know, they're like bleeding from the nose. Like these things are reasonably common. And, you know, the sources as typically arrayed to explain that do a pretty good job. Like it's strikingly consistent, at least certainly in my experience. But then I would just say that, you know, you then read the ethnographic sources and it's also just full of this like extended social universe. Like the world has a social texture, things in it are behaving certain ways. Personhood is not exclusively the domain of people. And it's all these like gradients of like more social, less social, alien, strange, hostile. And, you know, this is a layer. And I would say that, you know, if you're applying a shamanistic assessment, then this is another, you know, another dimension. And then depending on what you're ultimately looking at, like obviously your research question will then frame which bits you pluck from. But that fundamentally, you know, it's the using different labels for different bits that we separate largely arbitrarily for analytical reasons. But I consider them to be, by and large, within whatever relevant contexts, you know, like calling them complementary is almost like kind of like misplacing it a little bit. You know, these are more or less the same subsets of things. Just for the sake of our academic project, we slap different labels on them.
Thanks very much. Any questions from the room? Any questions online? No, it doesn't. So I think it just remains for me then to thank Andrew very much. Thank you for your time and sharing this with us. As Andrew mentioned, this is, or it comes from a published paper. I'll share the link in the chat or perhaps via the mailing list, but otherwise log on to or search for Andrew Skinner's ResearchGate profile, and you will find his papers, not just this one, but several others around this topic. So thanks everyone in the room. Thank you, Andrew. And thanks everyone online, and we'll see you for the next talk. Thanks. Keep well.